Hello, everyone.
Welcome to Corona Times with Pia and Irini and special guest Candice Nembhard, also known as Take 11 of our film series,
Residing in the Borderlands. And so today we're going to discuss with our guest Candice Nembhard about her practices in relation to some films that we hope you watched already.
Yeah, so the two films are Audre, Lorde, The Berlin Years from Dagmar Schultz, and Moon from Poliana Baumgarten, which, as I said, you have the links, so hopefully you've had a chance to dive in. If not, we're still going to have a great conversation and hope you'll enjoy it regardless. Let's get started. Candice, could you maybe tell us a little bit about why you chose the two films and what led you to them?
I want to say hi everyone, thank you for joining in from wherever you are. I picked Audre Lorde, The Berlin Years purely because it was kind of my first introduction to understanding the Black experience within a European context. I'd lived in Europe before when I was as a child, but that was in France. And prior to moving to Berlin in 2017, I was just doing a little bit of research about what it might mean for me to move there as a Black woman. And in that research, I came across Mayim, and through Mayim, came to know the breadth of Audre Lorde's work, and then I came across this film, and it was just a really stunning introduction to what I would potentially expect moving into a direct European context. And I also picked Moon as a sort of follow-on from the work and the ideas that were being discussed in Dagmar Schultz's film. And having worked with Poliana, the director of the film, directly and on previous projects, and as well as Moon itself, I really felt there was this thread that was tied between the two of them in talking about this work of community, of authorship, and of legacy in a way. And I really wanted to for people to see this parallel between the two as well, or at least get an understanding of what I believe to be the parallel between the two films.
Super. Can you talk a little bit about what it was like to move to Berlin and to exist in Berlin, also thinking about how the Afro-German community accepted you or how you found your space there as an Afro-British woman?
Mm-hmm. Moving to Berlin was really a decision that I made semi-auto on a whim. I graduated from university, needed to make some sort of decision for myself as to where I wanted to go career-wise, and I decided on Berlin, having visited Berlin a couple times before. And it was a place that had called to me for a long time, and I have family in Germany, and I was really trying to figure out this connection that I had to the country. So upon moving, honestly, it was slow going. I'm a bit of an introverted person, so it took me a while to kind of start forging these links with people that I would now consider to be part of my community. But it really started with online spaces, actually, digital spaces, and Facebook groups like the Black in Berlin Facebook group, the RBBH Facebook group, was kind of where I started really meeting a lot of people that I would now consider to be friends, family, associates, colleagues. It really started in these digital spaces and then started to kind of move towards these physical spaces and different locations that became hubs for a lot of us. But in regards to the Afro-German community, that was something that took a while, just purely on a language basis. My German was pretty poor, still is actually, but my German was pretty poor when I first moved. I'd studied it before. I had a base for the language, but not a fluency to the language. And I think that definitely affected how and who I was able to communicate with. But generally speaking, I was really in awe of many Black people that I met in Berlin, whether they were German or not. Just purely because the experience is not a monolith. And so it was really interesting to kind of compare and contrast the different ideas and understandings of Blackness within an American, British and a European context, all in one space. I believe a really kind of great illustration of that was Jessica Lawrence Taylor. She used to run these Black in Berlin salons when I first moved. I think they'd been ongoing before I'd moved to Berlin. But when I did move, I remember going to these salons and it was a mixture of people, and it would usually focus on one person and their practice, and then it would open into this wider discussion. between Black people, white people, Asians, and so on and so forth. So that was kind of my introduction, really just digital spaces, trying to discover those, and then moving into like physical spaces, and then understanding the community practice that is resolved around these community spaces as well.
I wanted to ask, you have been involved in different film projects, either as an actress, we saw you in one of them, but also in curating your own film series, and maybe you can tell us more about this aspect of your practice, and if you connect it somehow to your other aspect of practice, which is poetry, and maybe, I don't know, I wanted to ask how it resonates also with the film, because we have been listening to a lot of poetry in the film, and how it can be like a means of challenging the way we feel, so it has this potential capacity for change. So what do you think about poetry as a means of expression, but also, well, how do you perceive film as another means of expression?
I think people who know me quite personally are probably sick and tired of me talking about archives, and I'm so honestly, they're really sick of it, which is, I'm sorry, but I'm really fascinated by protecting and maintaining the voice, and that sort of work has really come through quite strongly since living in Berlin. I'm really intrigued about how we are able to sort of pass these stories on and these ideas on through something as simple as a recording, whether it's you recording on your phone at a rally, or whether it's something like this where we're having a conversation and in two different time zones and we're trying to connect with one another. I'm really quite passionate about this idea of protecting and maintaining these voices so that they can be instruments and tools for us as we go forward, and as we raise a new generation of children. I really think it's important to understand these past voices and protect them as much as possible. And so working in Berlin as a poet, I was thinking of how often I would go into live performance spaces, but there was no documentation of the event. And whereas I strongly believe in experiencing something live, some of the words and discussions that happen in that moment, I believe could have a great impact for future generations. And so I was really intrigued about this idea of documenting and maintaining the voice. And then I was thinking about that in an audio-visual kind of way, and how we document the voice within film. And something that I came to love growing up was watching spoken words when I was younger, looking at Def Poetry Jam, looking at Brave New Voices. A lot of these are very American, granted, but still this idea of focusing on the individual and allowing them to not only claim ownership of their voice, but of their image and of themselves using their voice. And so I was looking about how we can maintain the voice within cinema, especially from perspectives that are not often heard from or not often celebrated and lauded publicly. And that's kind of how my film series, All Fruits Ripe, came about. It's actually kind of selfish, if I'm quite honest. Just wanting to see myself reflected in audiovisual spaces. And I've just had the pleasure and the privilege of working with young budding filmmakers and poets who are really interested also in archiving their voices and maintaining some sense of ownership of themselves and their output. So in terms of poetry and film, the two go hand in hand. Really, honestly, I think if you think about the practice of poetry, understanding form, understanding output, understanding imagery, it's very much hand in hand with cinematography in effect, understanding how to frame something, understanding how to put something in a particular context. They're kind of one in the same. And so I'm really intrigued about this next wave of what's been called, I guess, cinepoetry, which is looking at the poem as a visual and audiovisual form. And I think that's what I'm trying to spearhead, at least with All Fruits Ripe, the series. But there are plenty of practitioners that have been doing it years and years and years before I decided to come up with my little thing.
Sure. Yeah, I want to pick up on a couple of things you've just mentioned. One is talking about archive documentation. How do we sort of keep track of our lives, our own stories, the stories of our loved ones, etc. And I'm curious how you would see that in the context of the Audre Lorde film, because that is so intimate. And yet, one of the things I really like about the film is that it mixes these moments of her, sitting in bed and giving giving advice, and her eating and her dancing, but also with her public persona and also with her politics. And I think there are 2 or 3 different people in the film who say, what I loved about Audre was that she had everything was somehow lined up, that she was consistent. And I don't know, maybe you can talk a little bit about what you felt when you saw the film and about this archive and documentation in that context.
I was amazed at how close you can get to people, and I think that's what I really admire about archives, is just how close you feel to a subject or an idea, and how close and how involved you feel. But when I first watched the film, I hadn't even moved to Berlin yet, and I was really fascinated about what role I would play as a black woman moving into that context, having seen or having witnessed black women that have come before me to play their role and play their part, and impart something that I too might be able to take on the baton and move on. I think what I found quite enriching about it is the personal bond that Audre had with people, and like you said, how consistent her voice was with people. And that comes from, I guess, being an academic, that comes from being a writer, but that also comes from having to use the same language to empower oneself in order to empower other people. But trust is really at the heart of it. I mean, there's a lot to be said about archives and the bias in archives, and how they can be maintained to influence a specific idea or specific output. So it also comes down to perspective. But I think trust is really what has to be at the heart of any archives, that you have to trust that people are willing to give this information, that people have to trust that this information that they are providing will be well looked after, well maintained. And trust that people will respond to it and react with it and make it their own in many ways. I'm really intrigued about like what Audre's vision for this film was. As I'm sure she was aware of being documented. I wonder how she thought about how her ideas, how her words, how her interactions with people would be framed. And I think it's been framed very well and very interestingly. I think it's very, very intimate. But I'm really interested in if Audre was directing this herself, what would she change? And would her authorship change? Would her voice change? Or would it... I reckon it would still stay the same. But I think it's really about the trust that she had between the people in her circle, and the communities that she worked in, that allowed us to kind of gain this closeness and this level of respect for her words and for her outreach as well.
Director that filmed the film, so Dagmar, we see her visually a lot, hanging out with her, talking about her, but at the same time we don't know what relationship they had exactly. We know from I think the title of the director that she presents herself as friend and colleague, but we don't know more about them. And I was just wondering, we were discussing about it also before, how being a friend of hers, but also a white woman who is trying to find this common ground with another black woman, is framing a perspective about Audre's life. So I was wondering, to what extent it played a role in shaping the perspective that we see in the film. What do you think? Because we see her a lot, right? She's quite present, but I'm just wondering what role she played.
I feel that one of the challenges of the film is that she's so present without explicitly situating herself, and we can never really know what happens in production, why that is, but that's just something that I noted as interesting. And then for me, also responding to your question about what would it have been if Audre had been the director, I really like that one scene where they're sitting by the lake, and Audre takes the camera and says, what would happen if I put it like this? And in that moment, there is this sort of sort of moment of her own agency and not just responding, because I can remember, for example, another moment where she's told, like, oh, you know, we want to capture the image of the FKK beach, you know, you have to get out of the frame or whatever. And in that, and you see this sort of her response of like, no, I'm not going to get out of the frame, sort of a little sparkle in her eye. But I really like that moment of her actually taking the camera and saying, what would happen with this? So I don't know, what do you think about that and about what Irini was saying as well in terms of voice?
I think it's important to understand that when, in regards to filmmaking, it's a collective effort, and there are so many voices that come into play to craft the final product or the final edit that a lot of people see. And so everybody's voice is imparted within the process of making a moving image, picture or film. So whereas the director will have a sort of rounded vision of what the final output would be or should be, there's the people that do the sound, there's the people that actually edit the moving images, and there's post-production, there's pre-production, there's all these things. I mean, obviously it's a little bit more intimate and not necessarily like a magic motion picture film spearheaded by Disney. You know, there's a little bit more intimacy in there, and it's also not scripted. But I think it's interesting to see how much agency you have over your own voice when it's somebody else that's editing your voice. So you yourself as the subject might have complete agency over what you say and stand by what you say. But it's interesting how that voice can be manipulated by somebody else's vision. I think that's what it's important to take that into account when you're watching any film, whether it's a documentary or whether it's a drama or a comedy. Just how much the subject's voice can actually be manipulated but in the final output. I do agree. I think it would have been very interesting had it been directed, or at least the vision of it been directed by Audre. And I think what I find fascinating is Dagmar's decision to put herself into the film as well. And what is it that she's trying to say by placing herself within the context of the film? Is it about Audre's outreach to different communities? Is it about looking at racial barriers and how these can be broken down within the context of like the Afro-German community? Or is it just to establish and situate oneself and say, I was here too? There's a plethora of reasons, and I'm sure we can ask Dagmar herself if we wanted to. But I do question the role of like white women. This is not just against Dagmar, but I do question the role of white women who purposefully enter into black spaces and document these spaces. Like what is their intent? And I question that with any form of documenting. To be honest, whether it's audiovisual or not, any form of documentation. Like what is your intent by being in a space that isn't necessarily by you or for you, but you're somehow welcomed into it. And I think that's a question that I would love people to have asked for themselves, like watching the film and also watching like Poliana's film. It is this role of authorship, it is this role of agency, but it's also a matter of respect as well. If you've been invited into a specific space, and given some sort of authority to document this space, is the duty to your own vision, or is your duty to the vision of the people that you're actually documenting? Like what needs preserving in this space? And for me, it's obviously Audre Lorde's legacy, but it's not just her legacy. It's what she imparted. It's the foundation that she laid down for a community of people that had their own voice. They just didn't know how to amplify it and unify it. And I think you do see part of that process within the interview segments of the film, within these moments where Audre does take control of literally of the narrative, of the visual narrative, and say, no, this is how I want to frame it. So there are those moments there. But at the end of the day, she didn't have the final say on the final edit. So for me, what happens on screen is just as important as what happens off camera. And in trying to understand ownership, in trying to understand voice, in trying to understand perspective. And effectively, filmmaking is about perspective. Whose perspective is prioritized and whose is pushed to the side. So there's I could talk about it forever. There's so many questions, but but generally speaking, it's trust, respect, framing, perspective, and these what if questions. had the camera been put into the hands of somebody else, and the editing decisions had been put into the hands of someone else?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think there are a lot of questions we can't answer there, but one thing that I did also find interesting is that Dagmar Schultz also was a publisher, and so she was also one of the editors of Farbe and I forget what the name of the other book was.
The Showing Our Colors one.
Yeah, that's Farbe, and then I thought there were two books, but maybe I'm just forgetting. But of this landmark book of Afro-German women telling their stories. And so for me, also coming from this, US POC context, it is strange to have a white woman so prominently positioned, but I wonder if maybe Audre Lorde herself answers the question a little bit in the segments where she speaks directly to white people and mostly to white women and saying, this is your problem too. And you need to be able to be there in the spaces and in the context where my voice won't carry and where my voice won't reach someone. And so I don't know if that's the beginning of part of an answer.
But herself, in the film, she says that it's important how we deal with difference. So, in a way that we don't ignore it, we don't try to destroy it, but we try to work through it. So it's okay to acknowledge that there are differences, but there are also shared struggles, or that there can be common grounds between white women and black women for sure. And I think that's what she also wanted. She wanted to create a space for Afro-German women and to somehow enhance this community. But she also wanted to find common grounds, I think. And also herself being an outsider, as she called herself, and coming to a new context, she wanted to find this common ground for herself between African American women and Afro-German women, between Afro-German women in Germany and white women in Germany. So I think, maybe the film itself has some answers to our questions.
I thought it was interesting also that she was very, very supportive of, for example, the Schokoladenfabrik, that initiative.
It's Schokofabrik.
Schokofabrik. My mistake, my bad.
You're hungry.
I'm hungry. And I thought it was super interesting that she was so supportive in talking about, also post-wall movement, women's movement, and all the energy that was there. And I know from another context, from a GDR context, that she also spoke to women on that side of the wall, so before the wall fell. And she spoke specifically, in that context, she spoke specifically to Afro-German women and Afro-German men, basically saying, you need a community, you need to build community, how can we get Afro-German people together? And so I think, one of the other stories told in the film that I really liked was this thing about having these two modes. She gave a talk, and then she said, thank you so much for coming. Could the white women please leave? And the black women, the Afro-German women, please stay and do not leave until you've spoken to one other Afro-German woman. And that as a move is just amazing to me, as a sort of community building, sort of like firm, but also convivial move to create community. I thought that was very, very amazing, and showed also these two sides of being like, I am myself, I am making the work that makes sense to me as an Afro-American woman, as lesbian, etc., and that I share with whomever wants to listen, but I also protect this space and build and foster this space that's really specific and dear to me. So.
No, I vehemently agree with you. Some really, really great points there. I think just to kind of go off your last point about community among black women. So often when we're tokenized in predominantly white spaces, there is this underlying competition between the two of us that, okay, I have to act this way or I have to act this way in order to not be seen as this kind of black person, or in order to be respected by these people. And there's something really powerful about removing the obstacle, and I say obstacle in as kind a way as possible, removing white people from the equation so that you remove the sort of catalyst of competition, and saying, okay, if we remove this out of the situation and actually say that we're all on a level playing field, how do you communicate with one another if you no longer see each other as competition? If you no longer see each other as a threat, but actually a potential bond, a potential friend, a potential sister, and you allow each other to speak in a language that's most common between them. And I find that's just such a small move, but it's such a mighty gesture at the same time. To say that, yes, I understand that there's a way that you speak and carry yourself within a very broad context, but if you bring it down to the essence of who we are as people, who we are as women, how does that change if you're not having to constantly like reaffirm yourself, but allow yourself to just be within a specific context? Such a powerful move. But I do like this idea of bringing each other forward and bringing each other to the front, and removing this idea of difference. I think my brain kind of moves like this, so I'm going to go back and forth. But I was thinking also what you were saying about difference and similarities. And for me, you cannot establish how you were similar without acknowledging how you were different first. And I think a lot of people who are not within Black, and then more broadly like BIPOC spaces, always are trying to find a way that they're different to absolve them of their, are always trying to find ways in which they are similar to absolve them of the way that they are different. And for me, I think that's a cop-out to just say, oh, but we're both women, we go through this experience, and not understanding how being a white woman also is a privilege in itself. Yes, you are still a woman, but there are many things that you are privy to that a lot of Black women aren't, let alone Black women who are queer, Black women who are disabled, Black women that suffer with mental health issues, etc., etc. And I think what I enjoyed about sort of Audre's commandeering, if you will, for lack of a better word, was her ability to understand her privilege as a Black American woman who was educated and was educating people, who was very mindful and quite honest and open about her education, about her status, and was able to come into a space and say, actually, you're all intelligent women, you all have these resources. And I think that's what a lot of communities need. Somebody who might not be privy to your experience, but has a very rounded, objective understanding of your experience, and can just point to these different tools and resources and say, hey, you have this, this, and this, and this. I put this in the middle and you all come together. You can build something out of this. And I think that's how strong communities grow. I think that's how they build. It's not necessarily that you have to have experienced it from day one to the end. It's just a matter of perspective and understanding that there are wider things at play here that maybe you are missing out on because you've been told that you're not supposed to speak to each other, because you've been told that you're in competition with one another. And also that in regards to framing, I think you can say that about the film itself and Dagmar's vision about, okay, I myself am a white woman, yes, but what can my framing, what can my resources as an educator, as an academic, as a publisher bring to this narrative that already exists? How does my framing of these voices, these very powerful voices, affect that? And I think there are many attempts in the film to be mindful of herself as a white woman, and maybe even positioning herself within the context of the film just to say that, yes, I am a white woman, but I am working with these people and trying to amplify these voices. Others may disagree and others may have their comments on that. That's fair enough. But I think there is a sense of agency in establishing yourself and rooting yourself in something, even though you may be different or apart or maybe outside of it. So yeah, my brain kind of went back and forth there, but I very much agree about these perspectives. Yeah.
I mean, we haven't discussed almost at all about the short film.
Yes.
So, which is also a completely different means. I feel it's not a documentary film. For me, it was even like a video work, like a not necessarily a short film in the strict sense of having a narrative like a short story. It was way more. It was a video work for me rather,
Yeah.
in the sense that it was more poetic in its language and more abstract, and also incorporating poetry and dance as well.
Yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts on that, and also, you know, thinking about community and such. What was the experience for you? I thought it was very interesting for you to talk about the different voices that come together to make a film. And so, what in that case, what was your experience working as part of that film, and yeah, seeing that come together?
I think I had the pleasure and privilege of working with Poliana before on a separate project. And what I've always been really fascinated with and impressed by is her ability to kind of implement practice, or praxis even, as an art form, but also just as a way of manifesting one's beliefs and one's attitudes towards community practice. And working on Moon was, I have to say, such an honor and such a privilege. We had a cast of and a crew. Everyone was a person of color, and what I really enjoyed is how much everybody's voice was respected in the process of putting it together. I agree with you. I wouldn't necessarily call it a short film necessarily. It is very much a video piece, but I think it's also a video piece that implements Poliana's vision of community and how she works within the community. So outside of these sort of video pieces that she creates, she's a video journalist, and I think that eye is so pertinent to how you make these creative works. Because you understand the idea of representing somebody's voice and perspective in a way that removes your bias and removes your personal vision, but somehow respects the subject and what they contribute to the wider project and to the wider end product. And I think if you understand that about her work outside of her creative practice, you can see just how much it influences and informs what she does when she works with people. She makes sure that everyone's well catered to. She makes sure that everyone's perspective is well respected within the production of the film and as well as the end product of the film. And she makes sure there's this sense of love and camaraderie. Everyone feels like they have a role to play and a part to play in bringing this together. And I feel that's how, for me, filmmaking should be. It shouldn't just be... I mean, it's important that your vision as a director, as an editor, as a sound engineer is brought to life. But at the end of the day, they have to all function in a sort of unity and a sort of harmony. And it was I would say completely, it was a harmonious process to make this film. But yeah, I think Poliana's work is really about an implementation of like practice and your beliefs, and standing by that in actually the production of making something. It's it's a complete and rounded, beautiful experience, and I'm so grateful that she brought this to life and I was able to be a part of it. And yeah, I don't know how to say any more than just singing her praises and singing her work.
I wanted to bring up something that I really felt in Poliana's work, as well as it's something that Audre Lorde talks about a lot, which is the erotic. So the erotic, the sensual, that as being an important cornerstone for building community, especially for Audre Lorde. Of course, it's about building community between women identified, or lesbian women, but also women in general. When you stop, like you were saying, when you stop competing with each other and start to share space and be together, and also dance and eat and and have sex and all of this whole spectrum of what the erotic and what the sensual can be. So I wanted to read something from Sister Outsider and then hear a little bit of your thoughts. So here we go. The erotic is a measure between the beginnings of our sense of self and the chaos of our strongest feelings. It is an internal sense of satisfaction to which, once we have experienced it, we know we can aspire. For having experienced the fullness of this depth of feeling and recognizing its power in honor and self-respect, we can require no less of ourselves. It is never easy to demand the most from ourselves, from our lives, from our work. To encourage excellence is to go beyond the encouraged mediocrity of our society. But giving into the fear of feeling and working to capacity is a luxury only the unintentional can afford, and the unintentional are those who do not wish to guide their own destinies. And I'll read another extract. There are many kinds of power, used and unused, acknowledged or otherwise. The erotic is a resource within each of us that lies in a deeply female and spiritual plane, firmly rooted in the power of our unexpressed or unrecognized feeling. In order to perpetuate itself, every oppression must corrupt or distort those various sources of power within the culture of the oppressed that can provide energy for change. For women, this has meant a suppression of the erotic as a considered source of power and information within our lives. We have been taught to suspect this resource, vilified, abused, and devalued within Western society. On the one hand, the superficially erotic has been encouraged as a sign of female inferiority. On the other hand, women have been made to suffer and to feel both contemptible and suspect by virtue of its existence. So I definitely recommend the essay. You can find it online as a PDF. But this is something I've been thinking about a lot recently. How do we live the erotic, not just in what she's calling like a pornographic sense of consuming others or of being consumed, but in a sense of passion for our lives, for our friends, for our communities. So I was curious how this may resonate with you. Yeah.
And the film as well.
And the films.
Very beautifully read, by the way, I must say. I think uses of the erotic is something that I've been trying to ruminate on actually for some time, as a black woman whose sexuality is often weaponized and used against her and used as a way of belittling her ability. And I think it's a fine line that black women have to tread in learning to love their femininity and using their femininity in a way that actually supports their sort of internal moral compass, their system, how they relate to other people, how they see themselves, in a way that isn't about consumption, but actually about blessing oneself, about empowering oneself. It's a struggle that I'm sure that myself and many other black women go through. But I think the use of the erotic is understanding about the boundaries of fear and how fear can be a powerful tool to empower oneself, but also inspire others. I'm so blown away when I meet black women who are so calm and centered within themselves because they are aware of their own power. They are aware of their own output, and they're aware of their own contributions, but they're also aware of their own limitations. I think it takes a lot of courage and strength to know what you excel at and what needs working on. There's a real power in understanding yourself as a rounded being, not just as a sexualized version of yourself, or understanding yourself as something that's there just to produce labor. And in the context of the film, in Poliana's film, I should be specific there, what I found interesting is that balance between stillness and peace and the erratic as well as the erotic. For though I'm sure hopefully you've all had a chance to watch it, but what I find really beautiful is you're kind of looking at two sides of the same coin, and that's my interpretation of it. You have this idea of the subject and the idea of the stillness that can exist within someone in this process of growth and coming to learn and love oneself. But also the chaos that has to kind of ensue to get there. I don't think you can get to a place of growth and love and accepting and understanding without first going through the nasty bits of crying, of torment, of doubt, of fear, of displacement even. And I think there's a really neat balance between this duality that exists within a lot of people, black or otherwise, of getting to know and love oneself. And I think the way that the film, Poliana's film, plays with the erotic is in the distance. And I feel that so often when we talk about eroticism, we're talking about connection, but there's actually something really, really powerful about the distance between people and how you can empower oneself within space. And if you notice, she has these really beautiful locations that she's chosen within the context of the film. And there's always the singular subject that exists within this particular space and how they interact with this space. And I think that honestly that's how I think we step into our erotic power, is understanding the spaces that we inhabit as beings, and how much we're influenced by the spaces that we live in, that we work in, that we grow in. And I feel like it's really about this rounded context of like who you are as an individual. What is your inner world like, and how does your inner world compare, reflect, or work with the outer worlds that you inhabit? And the two aren't often the same. And I think that's where the power of the erotic for me really lies. It's about finding that thread that lives between your internal world, how you see yourself, how you see your surroundings, and what the actual world is really like, and trying to be okay with finding your own harmony within that. Sorry, I'm also a really animated speaker, so my hands do a lot of this, but it is what it is. But yeah, I think it's really in the context of Poliana's film, it really is about distance and space as much as it is about this idea of community and togetherness. And somehow for me, it's sort of like an infinity loop. It kind of just like flows into one another.
Do you have,
No.
Is there any other? I guess the other thing would just be if you wanted to talk a little bit about poetry in your own practice, also as it's relating to film, perhaps. But I leave it to you.
Yeah, for sure. Where do I even begin? My goodness. I guess it would. I guess it would be good to situate it in terms of like my relationship to Berlin and what Berlin has offered me maybe, and how that relates back to the film. So like I said, I moved to Berlin after I graduated, and I did a literature and creative writing degree. And I felt really frustrated at how little I thought I meaning as a black person, a black queer person, was reflected in the work that I was studying. And so discovering poets like May and discovering writers and academics like Audre Lorde was such a blessing. To know that discussions of black womanhood and black queerhood as an intersection could be put into the written form and expressed in terms of spoken word in cinema. So that was really a blessing. And I think what really sort of corralled and shaped my voice was Poet and Prophetess, which is a collective that I'm in with two brilliant writers, Esther Kondo and Trovania Delille. Esther, who is a black German, and Trovania, she is from Haiti originally but has grown up since her teen years in Germany. And for me, that was really such an absolute blessing. I cannot thank the universe enough for bringing them into my life. Understanding this idea of the black voice and the practice of storytelling, the practice of oration, which is something that I've been really interested in as of late, this idea of oration. And working with them and watching them grow in their work and their power has played a huge influence on me in terms of what I want to write about. And I think we mentioned this earlier on, but my practice is really focused on community and the communities that I'm a part of. And they really inspire my voice. I think I did an interview recently, and somebody was talking about like how do these communities affect my practice. And the thing is, like, I wouldn't have a practice without these communities. And I have to make it clear that I don't do this on my own. I'm very much influenced by people that support me and support my vision of the world. And really my vision of the world is trying to shine a light on things that people maybe experience but don't often see, and trying to give some space to that. And I'm inspired by Audre, and similarly coming out of it from an quote unquote outsider context. I'm not a black German, but I understand the experiences of feeling displaced. I understand the experiences of living this duality, this idea of having double consciousness. I can understand that and I can relate to that, but it's just about how do you contextualize that within a German context. And in regards to the poetry that I'm writing and hope to share with people, and how that relates into the films that we've chosen, I think I mentioned this before, but it's like a continued manifestation of people's work and ideas. I think you constantly have to manifest yourself within your outputs in the communities that you work in, and it's a daily operation to love oneself. And I think through writing, if I can affirm myself and affirm what I believe, affirm the people that work with me and around me, then I feel like I'm on the right track, really. And in regards to the film, what I really admire is that Poliana's film has 2 different poems. That one was written by Audre Pechman, and the other written by Poliana herself. And it's interesting how Poliana distorts her voice. So she's reading the poem, but she distorts her voice. But Audre's voice, I don't believe there's been much editing to her voice in post-production. And I like this idea that she puts herself in it, but she doesn't take away from the other voices that contribute to the film, that actually like help shape and narrate the film as well. And I think you can also see the poetry in how she captures Janae is the other person that starred in the film as well, and how she captures Janae's movements as well in this we filmed in this really beautiful like train station in Berlin. Like it was on the U5, and like one of these like really old stations, but it had this gorgeous backdrop. And I really like how she finds the poetry in movement. She finds the poetry in languages that don't necessarily require knowledge of English or German. And I think that's the beauty of poetry, that it doesn't just exist in the written form, that it exists in the spoken form, that it exists in this performative aspect as well. And even in the things that we don't say, and in the distance, like I mentioned earlier. I'm kind of like buzzing around in my head a little bit, so I apologise. But I think what poetry's been like a real glue is kind of what I want to get at for me, and understanding how poetry can exist in different forms, and understanding the role of the poet, the role of the orator, in giving life and giving voice to themselves, but also in the people that they represent. And I know there's a lot of talk about representation and how we see ourselves, how we share our ideas with people. But I think representation cannot come without accountability. And if you are choosing to represent a certain idea, platform, or community, then you have to take accountability for the work and the ideas that you put out there. And also, unfortunately, take a lot of the flack for things that are misrepresented or misconstrued in the process of trying to represent something. I really just hope that through looking at these films and looking at these practitioners, that people come to their own understanding of representation, of accountability, of framing, perspective, voice, but also find the courage to love and respect their own voice. When I came to Berlin, I didn't think anything that I'd written prior as a poet, as a performer, mattered. And it does matter, but I have to make it matter, and I have to give it the context to make it matter. And I think that's what I've learned vehemently through working with people like Poliana, working with people like Esther and Toby from Poet and Prophetess, and through All Fruits Ripe, is really about understanding how to frame your own voice, how to frame your own narrative, and give it its own level of importance that nobody else can give it. And that work is, like I said, is continuous. But it's such a blessing to really step into what you believe and to step into what you say and own it, like no one else can. So that was a lot, but I hope
Great.
people get where I'm going with this.
It's great.
Thanks for sharing.
Yeah, thank you a lot. I think we'll probably wrap up there unless there's any final comment or recommendation you have for people in thinking about these films and thinking about the erotic in their lives also right now.
Okay, for sure. Always thinking about the erotic. I think a lot of questions I get asked is like, where do I find these people? Where do I find these communities? How do I connect with other people that have similar ideas, and so that we can come together? And although I'm not physically in Berlin anymore, I'm still connected to a lot of groups there. So maybe it might be helpful to just name drop a few organizations that people can get involved with to maybe explore some of these ideas and visuals further. Obviously, little self-plug, I have All Fruits Ripe, which is the film series. It was in the physical, but we'll have to take it digital now due to the pandemic, but not to worry about that. I have a little list. Let me just check my list, consult. So I would say, in terms of organizations and platforms, CIJ, which is the Centre for Intersectional Justice, that's spearheaded by Emilia Roig. Really beautiful organisation. Emilia is such a lovely person as well. So I would definitely, and I believe it's still based in Neukölln in Berlin, so I would definitely check that out. There's Ria Ramjohn's Wave Group, which is really about like an activism and action group. and looking at the intersections within different social groups as well, and how they can come together to physically implement their ideas. For sort of cultural, social events, I would definitely recommend Black and Brown Berlin, which is spearheaded by Femi, I believe. And that's just an online platform to discover any events that are run by or run for Black and Brown people living in Berlin. I think publication-wise, I would say Contemporary And, which is an online arts magazine that looks at art and art theory, art criticism coming from the African diaspora. Really brilliant publication, and I think Will Furtado is the digital editor of that. And lastly, for those of you that are YouTube, like to go on YouTube wormholes like myself, I believe Ezra Karakaya she's a legend and a half, and I absolutely love this person. Has a really cool series like Black Rock, I think it was Black Rock TV, and thank you, Black Rock Talk on YouTube. And that's even more pertinent because it's actually in German as well. I think a lot of these ideas we can talk about this another day, but a lot of these ideas are put forward in English, and I think it's really important that these discussions about race and identity and culture and community are happening within the German language within Germany. Oh, and last two I would say is there is this new platform that's just started up on IG, I believe, called, excuse my poor German pronunciation, Erklär mir mal, or Erklär mir mal, there's a umlaut. And then the Formation Now Festival in Hamburg, which is really, really dope. Like a DIY run festival for writers, performers, musicians as well. And I absolutely love Hamburg. So I think it's such a wonderful space for innovation and with young people in the arts. So hopefully, what I might do is if people didn't get that, I can just maybe write it down and put it in a comment or something afterwards so people can revisit them. And I think that's it on my end in terms of recommendations. And of course, Savvy, I'm not going to forget. Of course, Savvy as well. Make that, if you're in Neukölln, make that trek to Wedding and go check it out. Are you open again?
Partially,
What's happening
so
with that?
sort of limited opening we have an exhibition of sort of archive materials and of books. And so that, mask is required and only a few people at a time. But there's some really great stuff that the team has curated from the collection. So it's really nice, rare publications, journals, etc. So definitely worth dropping by. And on the topic of Ezra Karakaya, she's our final guest. So yes.
My mind. You see.
So together with
love it. I need to tune in for that.
Yeah.
Are you doing that in the space?
Ezra will be our final speaker as soon as we can meet in person. That session's going to happen together with her friend and filmmaker Nilgun, and we're super excited to engage with them also because that session will be a challenge for us. It's going to be all in German, also because of everything you're saying, the importance to actually create spaces for these conversations also in German. That's it. I think we may have an opportunity to answer some questions. But other than that, that's it from us for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing all your thoughts with us.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it. I'm sorry for my hands.
It was great.
That's fantastic. That's great things.